Greetings, fellow Who-gazers, and welcome back to Doctor Who Literature, the new podcast taking you through the world of Doctor Who novelizations in publication order. My name is Jason, and I'm your host on this journey, this very long journey. Today, we are here to discuss Doctor Who and the Three Doctors. It is the 17th book put out by Target, including the 3 Frederick Muller reprints, and it's the last book that was published in 1975. My copy of The Three Doctors is the 1980s reprint. It does not have the original cover. What it has is a series of photorealistic illustrations of the 3 Doctors going Pertwee, Hartnell, and Troughton from left to right over a black circle, which is superimposed over a gorgeous purplish starscape. I actually prefer this to the original cover, which is probably one of the few 1980s reprints covers that you can say that about. But what I really want to talk about is what happens once you actually open the inside of the book. The very first page is a title page. It just says Doctor Who, The Three Doctors. Under that, my 11-year-old self wrote in black ink, on TV, 6/1/85, which in the American format is June 1st, 1985. I have no recollection of doing this at all, and if I did do it, it couldn't have been in very many Target books, because I don't recall seeing that in any of the other novelizations that I've opened for this project so far. As best as I can tell, June 1st, 1985, which was a Saturday, would have been the first time that I saw this story on television. New Jersey Network, operating out of Montclair, New Jersey, was one of the bigger players in North American Doctor Who PBS fandom. They were the first station that I was aware of to show the Pertwee era. They had started earlier in the year with Spearhead from Space, and they showed the episodes in movie format late on Saturday night. I was very young at the time, and watching Doctor Who and the Silurians in movie format, which started late and then went on for about 3 hours, would have been too much for my staying awake tolerances, so I can only recall falling asleep during episode 3. Or what would have been episode 3 had it been shown in episodic format. And we also only had the one television in our home, which had cable TV at the time. That was the only TV that I could watch this on. And if my parents were home on Saturday night, they got precedence over the television. So I rarely got to watch the Pertwee era on its original airing in 1985. I no longer have the memory for these things that I would have had at age 11. And I can no longer tell you the date that I watched any particular Doctor Who story for the first time, so I have no idea where this came from. In fact, as best as I can recall, I only would have seen the last half an hour of the story. My recollection is that I saw what would have been the equivalent of part 4, but I wouldn't have seen the beginning, because I do remember asking my friends at school how the story opened and why the first Doctor was only present inside of a glass cube. That's my memory anyway. The most curious thing about this notation is I didn't buy the Three Doctors novelization until almost 2 months later, on July 27th, 1985. That is a date that's burned in my memory. And to explain why I can remember having bought this book on July 27th, 1985, we have to do a little bit of time travel. So fasten your seatbelts and take a trip with me back 1 year to July 27th, 1984.
Live from Shea Stadium in Flushing, New York, Sports Channel presents Mets Baseball. Tonight, the Mets take on the Chicago Cubs. The starting pitchers for the Cubs: Dick Ruthven with a record of 2-6, an earned run average of 4.91. And for the Mets, Dwight Gooden with a record of 8-6, an earned run average of 2.91. Well, hi, everybody. I'm Ralph Kiner, along with Tim McCarver and Fran Healy, all set for the start of a 4-game series with the Chicago Cubs. Mets, of course, leading by 3.5. These two teams have a lot in common.
It's July 1984, and I've never even heard of Doctor Who. I'm 10 years old, a couple of months away from turning 11. The number one occupation on my mind, my number one fandom, is baseball, specifically New York Mets baseball. I became a Mets fan in the summer of 1981, shortly after baseball's infamous 50-game midseason strike ended. And April 1982 is when I was taken to my very first Mets game, which, of course, in true early 80s Mets fashion, they lost. Now, fear not, fans, I'm not going to be spending this whole episode talking about baseball, but to set the scene for you, 1984 is the year when the Mets became good. Through the shrewd acquisition of impressive out-of-town talents like Keith Hernandez and electrifying rookies like Darryl Strawberry and Dwight Gooden, whose name you heard mentioned earlier, the Mets found themselves in first place in late summer for the first time in well over a decade. July 27, 1984 is when the second-place Cubs, who were also surprisingly competitive for the first time in 15 years, came to town for a 4-game series. Dwight Gooden, the Mets rookie phenom, was pitching, and it was also Olympics baseball cap night, in recognition of baseball being an Olympic demonstration sport in 1984. The Mets were sponsoring a giveaway, a facsimile of the Team USA Olympics baseball cap. And if you watch the video of this game on YouTube, you will see a sea of fans wearing these distinctive red, white, and blue caps in the stands rather than the traditional orange and blue Mets caps. I was 10. My father took me, along with my Uncle Herb and my cousin Jonathan. I made a handmade sign at home celebrating Dwight Gooden's achievements. I was hoping to have that sign on television. What nobody told me is that the proper way to make a sign that shows up on television is with the bedsheet and paint rather than white printer paper and colored pencils. Also, it was raining and a drizzly night, and by the time we got from the car to the front gates of the stadium, the sign was pretty much unusable, so I crumpled it up, threw it out, and we sat there. I have never seen myself on the TV broadcast of the game, which is now archived in low-resolution glory on YouTube, so I have no idea if my mug ever got to the camera. Probably not, almost certainly not. But it was a terrific game. The Mets won 2-1, extending their lead on the Cubs to 4.5, and with the playoffs only a little more than 2 months away, the Mets seemed a mortal lock to make the playoffs for the first time since literally the day I was born. Of course, the Mets being the Mets, it wasn't meant to be. That was the last time they beat the Cubs, playing them 7 or 8 more times over the next 2 weeks. The Mets were consigned to second place by early August, and they finished the year in second place. And I had to go cheer for the Cubs to lose in the playoffs, which, in true pre-2016 Cubs fashion, they did in the first round. The World Series ends in mid-October. About 6 weeks after that, I discovered Doctor Who, and over the winter of 1984-1985, Doctor Who becomes my abiding obsession. Spring training comes in 1985. I follow the Mets very closely, and I go to another Mets game on April 12th, 1985, also available on YouTube. I had won those tickets as part of a competition for my local newspaper. I had correctly guessed how many home runs Darryl Strawberry was going to finish with in the 1984 season. It took 2 home runs on the last day of the season for him to accomplish this goal of matching my prediction, and I had 2 tickets to a Mets-Reds game in early April. The problem is that was a weeknight game, and I ended up missing an episode of Doctor Who that was being aired on PBS, probably part 1 of Planet of Evil if memory serves me right. It's difficult keeping 2 fandoms at once when you're 11 and a half, and within a couple of weeks of that game, my Mets fandom disappeared, went into hibernation. I lost all interest in baseball, and it became Doctor Who every night, all the time, between the TV episodes airing at 7 p.m. on PBS and my novelizations, which I was getting 2 a week at that point. My Mets fandom remained dormant, and when they did finish in first place and go to the playoffs and the World Series, and when they won an equally electrifying World Series over the Boston Red Sox in October 1986, I was not paying one bit of attention. I didn't get back into baseball in mid-1987, and to this day, the Mets have never won another World Series. So, Doctor Who did sort of deprive me of that pleasure. Of course, now we're here in 2022, and my baseball fandom is rapidly dwindling and becoming theoretical, and you probably won't hear me mention it too many more times on this podcast. However, in the spring of 1985, something else happened. My local PBS station, Channel 21, announced that a Doctor Who convention was coming to Manhattan at the Roosevelt Hotel on Madison Avenue and East 45th Street, a one-day convention, July 27th, 1985, with Matthew Waterhouse as the guest of honor, if memory serves me right. I knew that I had to go to this convention, and the way that July 27th, 1984 is burned in my memory as a Mets game that I went to and saw the Mets win, July 27th, 1985, 1 year later, by which time I was not following baseball in the slightest, the Doctor Who convention became the most important thing in my life, and I sort of dragged my father into going along with me, since at 11 years old I certainly wasn't going into Manhattan by myself. We got to the convention, and it was not probably as organized as things are today, with Gallifrey 1 and Long Island Doctor Who with multiple tracks going throughout the day and easy access to the guest. I never saw Matthew Waterhouse. I don't recall any advertisement of any interviews with him or panels with him during the time that we were there. Most of what we did was the dealer's room. Spent a lot of time in the dealer's room, in fact. And what I didn't know is that my good friend Tom Beck, who is still a friend of mine today, was actually there at the same time, operating a table for his local fan club out of New Jersey. I would not have spoken to him, and it wasn't, many years later until I realized that we had been there at the same time. Lots of people showed up wearing Tom Baker scarves, which confused my father, not watching the show and not knowing about Tom Baker. He assumed that he was at a Truman Capote convention and was complaining about it for days afterwards. He also would not buy me any jelly babies because the ingredients he considered to be little more than poison. I did, however, have my share of novelizations. I could buy whatever I want. And there was a table piled high with all the books, including books that I'd never seen in my local bookstore. Armed with my knowledge from the L'Officier program guide, I knew which books I wanted to get, and I was able to do very well for myself that day. I was able to get novelizations of very important stories that I wasn't seeing at home on the bookshelves. I was able to get the novelization of The 10th Planet. I was able to get the novelization of The War Games. I was able to get the novelization of, hold on to your hats, The Keys of Marinus. And, of course, I was able to buy the novelization of The Three Doctors. We spent a lot of the afternoon in the hotel lobby, sitting on sofas, and I probably read half of The Three Doctors just sitting there until it was time to go into one of the ballrooms and watch a big screening of the movie format version of Doctor Who and the Dalek Invasion of Earth, the Season 2, 1964 William Hartnell original. My first time, outside of that opening snippet of The Five Doctors, seeing William Hartnell. My first time seeing the original companions, Susan, Ian, and Barbara. I knew it was an important story, and I sat there for 2.5 hours watching it in rapturous silence. My dad left me alone to run across the street to chock full of nuts and treat himself to some non-Doctor Who coffee. I can't imagine any scenario where an 11-year-old boy is going to be left alone, surrounded by a sea of grown-ups watching a 1965 black and white serial, but there you go. That was parenting in the mid-'80s for you. And when we got home, I would have recalled that I saw The Three Doctors, or parts of it, on television 2 months earlier, and I wrote in the book, on TV, June 1st, 1985, a notation that is still in the book today, and will be there until the end of time. Coming up next, I'm joined by my good friend Mark from the Trap One podcast, and we're going to talk about what The Three Doctors means to us. We're back now, and I'm joined for the second time on Doctor Who Literature by Mark from Trap One. Mark, welcome back to the program.
Thank you very much for having me back. It's a real pleasure.
I gotta say, Mark, you are the godfather of this podcast because you, 5 years ago, plucked me out of relative obscurity from my blog, Doctor Who Novels at WordPress, and you invited me on one of the early Trap One episodes to discuss Diamond Dogs by Michael Tucker, which In terms of Doctor Who novels, it's probably right down there about, number 990 or 991 in popularity and memorability. And from then, I've been a regular on the show, and now I'm one of your rotating panel of co-hosts. So thank you very much for foisting me and this podcast upon the world.
Very welcome. Thank you for taking part, for joining Trap One, and for having me on here. Remember when I was blogging about Doctor Who? You're always kind enough to leave messages in my posts, and that's how we started conversing about things. So yeah, it's great that we're podcasting together now.
It's a real pleasure. And how many episodes is Trap One up to at this point?
I think it's about 202, but sources vary. iTunes thinks I've broadcast or I've uploaded more than the host Podbean does. I think it's because the odd time I've uploaded them and then realized I forgot to put the music on, and I've had to re-upload it. And I think iTunes counts all of those, something like that. So it's approximately 202.
It's funny that this is your show and you are the creator and you have personally edited and uploaded every episode, and there's still no accurate count. God bless the
Yeah,
internet.
that's it. Yeah, it's a strange one, definitely.
And you are also becoming a lot more busy with non Trap One podcasts. What else have you been up to, and what sort of things have you recorded lately?
So I was recently a guest on Gallifrey's Most Wanted with Ross. We're talking about the Titan graphic novels, specifically the first collected volume of the 11th Doctor. So that was a lot of fun. And I am a semi-regular on Maximum Power, the Blake Seven podcast, which has some of the same co-hosts as Trap One, as well as a lot of the people from the Flight Through Entirety Doctor Who podcast. So it's like the love child of the two podcasts, really.
The love child of the two podcasts. Uh, yeah, Gallifrey's Most Wanted is a great show. My problem is I've got so many, and not just Doctor Who, but I've got so many podcasts on my Google subscriptions that I'm about 6 weeks behind. I get about 90 minutes of listening time in a day between exercise and washing dishes. But even listening 90 minutes a day, I'm still falling further and further behind because on a good day, I'll have about 4 or 5 podcasts that I like drop in. So I just finished a Gallifrey's Most Wanted episode from mid-January with Ross and Cy and Fraser, the latter two of whom are regulars on this show and on Trap One and pretty much everywhere else. So I'll have a way to go before I hear your Titan episode, but it is in my queue, and I have downloaded it, and I'll be getting to it real soon now.
Great, yeah. Hopefully you'll enjoy that one.
And I recently got booked for another appearance on the Joe Ford podcast universe. I'll be putting in an appearance on Hamster with a Blunt Penknife in a couple of weeks, and we're going to be discussing one of the last of the Seventh Doctor episodes that he has not recorded yet.
Excellent. Well, the Seventh Doctor era is among my favourites, so I will look forward to that one.
And he's only been at the show for about a year, but in that year, he's been recording pretty much. He pretty much releases an episode every single day of the calendar year minus holidays. So he's already done 11 out of the 12 McCoys. So I think I'll be the very last McCoy commentator.
Wow, that's impressive. I did the Happiness Patrol with Joe, so that was my Seventh Doctor contribution. But yeah, he must be hundreds of episodes ahead of Trap One and most podcasts, I think.
Yeah, this is a weekly show, and that can be a pretty strenuous pace. How he manages to put out a daily show is beyond me. And then he has 2 other podcasts on top of that, because he has his Star Trek project with Nathan from Flight Through Entirety. And then he and Jack in Australia have The Naimon Be Praised, which was his first podcast, which is a long-form weekly discussion. I was on an episode of that in the summer of 2021, and when they do a new season, I've got a pitch to do another episode with them. Hopefully it gets put through, because those two are a lot of fun to talk to as well.
Yeah, I enjoy that podcast as well.
So that keeps me pretty busy. But today we're going to be busy talking about Doctor Who and the Three Doctors, which is the 17th book put out by Target, and it's the first novelization that I did not blog about when I kind of abandoned my Doctor Who novels blog, at least the novelizations part of it, in early 2017. So I know I read this book 5 years ago in preparation for a blog post that in the event never got written. So I'm picking it up now, 5 years later, and going through my notes from 5 years ago. And the remarkable thing is that when I was going through my notes from 5 years ago, it was pretty negative because I had just read several very long, detailed Terrance Dicks books before that. So Planet of the Spiders had come out 1 month before in the release schedule. And my impression 5 years ago is that The Three Doctors was much thinner and more juvenile and didn't have nearly as much meat. That was my take. But as I'm going through my individual notes, there is so much to enjoy about the wit and the descriptions in this book that I have no idea why I was so negative on it. My guess is that I must have been burned out from reading and writing about the books every day, every other day. So I was probably just souring on the whole thing. But looking at it now with a fresh eye, this is a really funny book. So, what about this book appealed to you, and how did you come to volunteer to talk about this one on Doctor Who literature?
It's, I mean, I love multi-doctor stories. I absolutely love them. I never understand. Like at the moment, because we're coming up to the centenary, and then after that, it's going to be the 60th anniversary special. And you see people on Twitter saying, "Oh, I really don't want a multi-doctor story." And for me, I can't understand that. I love multi-doctor stories. I don't know why you wouldn't want multi-doctor stories for an anniversary, especially when Peter Capaldi and Jodie Whittaker have never had a multi-doctor story. It's the joy of seeing different incarnations interact that I love, and especially the ones who I haven't met yet. And obviously, this is the first one. This is the 10th anniversary story. It's the first three Doctors, kind of more or less interacting. And yeah, I always remember the interview with Barry Letts when he says that sort of taxi drivers and members of the public would always say to him, "I've got a brilliant idea for a story for you. Why don't you have all the three Doctors meet and team up?" And he would go, "Yeah, like everybody says that." And then after a while, they thought, "Well, actually, why don't we do that?" And they made the story, and and I love it. And for me, it was one that I read the target book of years before I got to see the episode. So it would definitely, when I saw the book, it would have been one that I would have grabbed out of just pure excitement to see it. Weirdly, the thing that I really remember from it is just a tiny detail. But when the second and third Doctors are escaping from Omega's castle, or it's described as a castle in here, which is not really the impression you get from the TV episodes, but they were escaping and they heading to the unit headquarters, which is in Omega's antimatter realm, and it describes how they've got this inbuilt homing instinct to find the TARDIS again. And that's something that really stayed with me because I thought, oh, that's a really interesting piece of sort of Time Lord ability and trivia. And that's something I always remember from being a kid from this book. That wow, that's great, and it's well before I suppose we learn about symbiotic nuclei and things in another multi-doctor story. That there is this, that it isn't just kind of purely machine, but there's this link that that each Time Lord has with the TARDIS, and that was something I really loved about it.
So you mentioned how you got the book in relation to seeing the TV episode. This was part of the Pertwee package that hit my corner of the U.S. on PBS in 1985. And as I mentioned earlier in the program, I wrote down in my copy of the book that I first saw this on June 1st, 1985, and then I bought the novelization a little less than 2 months later at my first U.S. convention. What I wasn't doing when I was 11 years old is I did not slavishly compare what changed in the book versus what changed on TV. In reading the book now, there's a lot of good lines from television, mostly what sound like Patrick Troughton ad-libs that are missing from the book. But in place of some of the missing last-minute funny lines, Terrance puts in an awful lot of description. Like you say, he says that Omega lives in a castle, which you don't get that on television because you have budgetary limitations and on location limitations. There's the famous example, which is mentioned on one of the classic series DVD documentaries, where somebody is reading from the book about the flame of singularity and how it towers up to infinity. And then the editor of the documentary cuts to this sad little tea kettle whistle of steam coming up through a wooden plank in the studio floor as a way of showing how Terrance's imagination and writing style is so much more vivid than what you could achieve in a studio in 1972. What are some of your best memories from the first time you read this book, and then, of course, from the time you read it just now in preparation for this episode?
Yeah, I know what you mean. The documentary, I think it's on the Day of the Daleks DVD, if memory serves. If anybody's looking for that one, I want to say it's called The Memory Cheats, but I'm not entirely sure. But yeah, I'm sure it's on that DVD. So yeah, it's well worth looking because they do some nice juxtaposition between the description in the books and then showing you the actual footage. But yeah, I think when you read through it, there's a battle in it, isn't there? Which is well, there's two action sequences, which obviously is much easier to write than to realize, that sound incredible in the book. There's the bit where the Brigadier, Joe, Benton, Hollis, and Tyler are driving away from Omega's castle in Bessie while dodging fire from the gel guards. And there's explosions going off, and the Brigadier's like doing some amazing driving, which on the screen is just the Brigadier driving slowly in a straight line while charges go off sort of either side of him. And then there's the battle at the end where even Joe is armed with a rifle, and they all rush out of unit headquarters and start blasting away at gel guards as the two doctors hit the deck. And Benton's got is it a Bren gun? Do you call it a Bren? Something like that. Anyway, like some kind of machine gun. And he also, the gel guards are a bit more impressive in the book in that they're not just blobs with a claw. They've got arms and legs and things like that. They're more like gel men. And one of them's running towards them, and he blasts it with this gun until there's just two legs running along afterwards. So there's some really great kind of visual stuff there that obviously they couldn't realize on TV, or was better in Terrance Dix's imagination after the event.
There was a moment, probably towards what is the episode 1 cliffhanger in the book, where a bunch of gel blobs charge into the doctor's office, and then they merge and they form into one enormous entity. So this is Terrance almost picturing the coming CGI revolution, because on TV you had the stuntmen and the unfortunate costumes, but earlier on you had sort of an animated superimposed effect, which again is more impressive in the book, where the characters can't quite see it because it's kind of out of phase, and on
Hmm.
television it's just primitive animation that's overlaid over the drawing. So Terrance certainly is much more in tune with the possibilities of what these creatures could be, as opposed to what you couldn't do in 1972. And of
Yeah,
course, the other part of the imagination you need to make this story work is this is Doctor Who's 10th anniversary story, and it airs on the 9-month, 2 years anniversary of the program's debut in December 1972. How did that happen?
yeah, it's the 10th season, isn't it, rather than the 10th year. But I suppose if you wanted a big crowd pleasing story to open your 10th season, it's you'd either do a Dalek story or the multi Doctor team up, which is going to bring viewers in. I guess it's going to maybe bring back some older viewers who've drifted away from it. Out of nostalgia for Patrick Troughton and William Hartnell as well. So it's a great way of just grabbing people's attention and bringing them back in. But I know what you mean about the thing about the gel guards. I think watching the TV show, you get the impression that the sort of amorphous stuff that's coming out of the drains is a different thing to the gel guards, and it had never occurred to me that they're supposed to be the same thing. But the books, there's a couple of bits of tidying up in the book. Actually, the book makes it clear that it's all the same stuff. That it's kind of this goo that can come out the drains, but then it can, like say, join all together, which would look amazing in CGI, wouldn't it? It'd be like the Terminator in Terminator 2. That's the liquid metal that just kind of like grows up out of the floor, and so that they can sort of join together to make the sort of the gel men or the blob men. whereas and also he describes that happening in the drains. I think that these things are joined together, whereas in the TV show, the gel guards just pop into existence in the grounds of unit headquarters. So it makes it clear that it's all the same matter. So I think that's a nice bit of tidying up from Terrance Dicks there.
You mentioned, of course, that we all look forward to these multi-doctor team-ups, and I should give credit to Peter Capaldi because he did a multi-doctor episode of sorts in his finale when he teamed up with David Bradley, who was standing in for the first Doctor.
I always forget about that as a multi-doctor story somehow. Yeah, but yeah, he did, didn't he?
You and I covered the novelization of that for the Resurgent Target line a couple of years ago, Twice Upon a Time.
Yes. By Paul Cornell, wasn't it?
Correct. Which, talking about Hartnell's appearance in this book, this was William Hartnell's, I think, last bit of television, and he was kind of incapable of memorizing a script at this point. So famously, he's sitting in his garage under a glass contraption, reading his lines one word at a time off the cue card and looking much older than he had in 10th Planet. This was not the first Doctor novelization, because you had obviously the 3 Frederick Muller books in the mid-60s that Target had reprinted in 1973, but this is the first original Target book written for the Target line by Terrance Dicks that has the first Doctor in it. So if you're reading the books in publication order, this is your first real glimpse of Terrance Dicks writing for William Hartnell. Soon enough, he will get to do his novelization of Dalek Invasion of Earth, and of course, Jerry Davis is coming down the line a few months later with 10th Planet. But this is really Hartnell's proper introduction to the line. How does the Hartnell Doctor come across in this book as compared to the jokey, over-the-hill, sexist, misogynist dinosaur from the mind of Stephen Moffat in Twice Upon a Time?
He's in it as little as he is in the TV story, isn't he? Really, because it's so many years since I read this book, I would have been, like not even a teenager the first time I read it, so I couldn't remember it that well, and it did make me wonder whether his part would have been expanded slightly, because there were earlier drafts of the script, weren't there, where they hoped they might be able to get William Hartnell there even for the finale, so that they could have the 3 Doctors kind of on set together. And it did make me think, after I finished reading it, it is a bit of a shame that we didn't get that. And rereading it, there was a bit where the Time Lords say, we're going to send you into the black hole, or through the black hole into the antimatter universe. And I thought, oh, are they going to do that? Is he going to actually appear in the book? As it would have been fantastic to see him in the TV show, but it's the same as happens on the TV episode, isn't it? They send him in his time eddy, in his glass sort of pyramid thing, in just so that he can talk to them. So it is a bit of a shame that Terrance Dicks didn't take the opportunity to have that, so that he to have the first Doctor standing alongside his successors, I suppose, like that. But yeah, he's not fleshed out very much, is he? Nothing's, I don't think, from his point of view in the book. You've still got that sort of nonsensical thing where, despite the fact that he's the youngest of the Doctors, he's the wisest and most experienced, which I think, to be fair, Paul Cornell does address in the novelization of Twice Upon a Time that isn't addressed here.
And this would have been a big influence on Terrance personally, because he then, 11 years later, for the 20th anniversary, writes Hartnell, or Richard Hurndall, the same way in The 5 Doctors, where he's the elder statesman. He's the only one who's able to understand the old High Gallifreyan transcription or translation of what the game of Rassilon is. And everybody waits for him to arrive before doing anything. And that's, of course, a nod to the fact that Hartnell is physically the oldest and white-hairedest of the Doctors. What disappointed me from my notes 5 years ago is that there's no proper physical description of Hartnell in the book, because you get a long description of Pertwee and an even longer description of Troughton. And Terrance doesn't have his trademark description the way that he has, the 3rd Doctor has the young old face with the shock of white hair, and, the 5th Doctor has this pleasant open face with the fawn blazer and the sprig of celery. He has not yet done his macro description of Hartnell because this is the first time out. So it would have been nice to have a little bit of a bigger build up. But also considering that he wrote this thing directly on the heels of Planet of the Spiders and it comes out 1 month later, he just doesn't have time to do his longer form 140-page books that he was doing even a year earlier at the beginning of the Target line.
Yeah, and the other thing that occurred to me talking about that is the way that he differentiates the different doctors, and it made me, because the sort of the accepted sort of fan terminology of the first Doctor, the second Doctor, the third Doctor obviously isn't there yet. So a lot of the time he calls the second Doctor Doctor Two, sort of capitalized like Doctor Two. So yeah, it made me wonder when did we start saying the third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, etc. Doctors? When was that when did that become the standard? And obviously that's been, I suppose, by younger fans now surpassed by simply calling the Doctors 1, 2, 3 up to 13. But yeah, I didn't. It made me wonder when that actually started. If I should have checked the Five Doctors novelization actually, because I can't quite remember how they're individually described in that one.
And that'll be coming up in about a year and a half on Doctor Who literature as we go in publication order. So make sure to stay tuned and subscribe to the podcast and be sure to download the Five Doctors in about a year and a half's time. But I believe starting with the Five Doctors in the JNT era, there's much more of an effort to market the past Doctors and differentiate them. So I think that's when the first, second, third comes about. And like you say, nowadays fans talk about 9 and 10 and 11,
Yeah.
which to my mind is not as lyrical as first, second, third. I still say 13th Doctor rather than 13. But anybody who comes in with the new series and internet fandom is definitely going to say 9 or 10 or 11.
Yeah, it's too ingrained, I think, in me since childhood. So yeah, I still use the full the full title.
That's one of those linguistic markers that sets you off as a fan from a particular era of the show's history rather than a modern day fan.
Definitely, yeah, yeah.
It's kind of like the New Adventures on Records Doctor Who in the 90s. They were just called the NAs, the NAs, the NAs. And at some point, modern day fandom on 21st century Twitter has started calling them the VNAs. I guess V for Virgin. Nobody ever called them the VNAs, but now that's the term that everyone uses. How did that come about? I mean, where did that come from?
Yeah, I don't know, because the uh, what are the because the new series ones, I can't remember. There's something similar, aren't they? Are they NSAs or something? Are they new series adventures, or
Yeah, the NSAs, the new series adventures.
is that right? It's something like that.
But it just shows you, every generation of fandom comes in and has their own way of thinking about things, and it supplants the old. So by speaking a certain
Yeah,
way, you and I mark ourselves off as hopeless old timers.
absolutely. Yeah. Reading the Twitter accounts of newer fans does definitely make you feel very old sometimes. Does make us feel like over the hill old timers.
Like the first Doctor himself in modern day fandom's eyes. So, in terms of multi Doctor
Yeah.
stories, of course, this is the first one. And I think this is probably the most important multi Doctor story because it sets the template. From every multi Doctor story on out, the Doctors hate each other and don't get along. And you have to wonder if Bob Baker and Dave Martin didn't have that idea. Do we get more multi Doctor stories in the future, and do they all have the same dynamic, or is this the reason for what we have now? This just set a mold that was so good that everyone else has to stick to it.
Yeah, it's such a good idea, isn't it? Yeah, it's hard to it is hard to imagine them doing it any other way now, because even stuff like Time Crash, although they sort of get on by the end, there's that immediate sort of kind of rubbing up against each other sort of thing, and famously Patrick Troughton and John Pertwee carried that over into their convention appearances as well, didn't they? That they would have that sort of verbal sparring as sort of part of their on-stage persona. So yeah, it's very effective.
And chasing each other around the convention hall with water pistols.
Yeah, I saw John Pertwee at a convention, but obviously I never saw Patrick Troughton. Unfortunately, he died before I even saw Doctor Who. But yeah, that would have been amazing to see.
Yeah, he died in here in the States in Columbus, Georgia, at a con in early 1987, and his very last interview was actually on YouTube somewhere, talking about which were his favorite and least favorite stories from his era. And when you're watching him, the day before he dies, there's no indication at all that he's sick. He's in his late 60s. He looks hale and hearty, and it's kind of sad to watch, knowing that he doesn't even have 24 hours left.
Wow, I didn't realize that. Yeah,
Yeah, 'cause he
that's
was
that's
he was still relatively young in his late 60s, whereas Tom Baker is now late 80s and still going strong and still doing multiple Big Finish audios.
yeah. He's still recording a lot, isn't he? Yeah, he's doing very well.
So, is the Three Doctors the definitive multi-doctor story, or is there a later one that you think is better or more fun?
I mean, for me, the Five Doctors, because it was only about the second pre-McCoy story that I ever saw. I got the VHS of it, and I watched that when I was like 10 or 11. I watched it over and over and over and over again, and I still absolutely adore that one. It's got more doctors, it's got more monsters, more companions. It's that for me probably is the definitive multi-doctor story, and yeah, I love every second of it.
Same here. That was one of my first because I started watching the show when it was nightly on PBS. Coming along famously from Time Flight, and we had the four-part edit. It was years before I knew that Five Doctors was actually made as a single movie because for me it was only the four-part story with our unique cliffhangers such as Sarah Jane rolling down a gentle slope or Anthony Ainley walking down a flight of stairs. Psst. But yeah, you certainly have, as you say, more companions, more returning monsters. Terrance revisiting some of his favorite lines of dialogue. Showing a Yeti, bringing back Jamie and Zoe and Liz and Mike Yates as phantoms, which is a terrific idea. Makes you wonder what would have happened if Terrance himself had written the Three Doctors rather than Bob Baker and Dave Martin, who were fairly new to the series, or if you had had somebody from the old days like David Whittaker come back and tell a story that
Yeah.
really leaned into the Hartnell era, brought back Ian Chesterton, brought back maybe a couple more Patrick Troughton companions. Because as it is, Troughton's companion in this one is Sergeant Benton, who he only had the one story with. But imagine if he was able to have a Jamie or a Zoe or even a Polly back to run around and reminisce with in this story. It could have been a lot more denser and multi-layered. And could have had a
Yeah,
lot more fond memories.
that would have been amazing, wouldn't it? Yeah, and really, it would be unthinkable now, wouldn't it, to not have the showrunner as effectively Terrance Dicks was one half of, not write that. You wouldn't have an anniversary or a multi-doctor story now with a guest writer like that, would you? Even if it was kind of a trusted regular.
And to be fair, Barry Letts was writing one episode a year, and the episode he wrote this season was The Green Death, which is, one of the greatest of all time.
Mm-hmm.
So they could either have put Patrick Troughton in The Green Death and made that the 10th anniversary story, since it aired much closer to the actual 10th anniversary, or they could have farmed The Green Death out to somebody else and had Barry and Robert Sloman write the 10th anniversary and make it a different story. That's an interesting game of what if.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? It's great though because I wouldn't. I mean, I don't know whether they gave the idea of Omega to the Bristol boys or whether they came up with it. But yeah, you wouldn't want to lose Omega from the mix, would you? I think it's such a great performance from Stephen Thorne because there's a couple of lines that are really famous from the Three Doctors, like the Brigadier's famous line about Chroma is missing from the novelization. But the line, a hero, I should have been a god, is in the book, thankfully, which I was really pleased about. A few years ago, maybe about 4 years ago, I saw Stephen Thorne at a convention.
Oh,
It was the
wow.
VORP convention in Manchester. So he was interviewed on stage, and then he delivered that line. So as elderly as he was at that point, he could still boom that line out exactly as he did when he was playing Omega. So that was hairs on the back of the neck, standing up kind of moment, getting to hear that live.
I guess the similar experience for me, I never had the honor of meeting Stephen Thorne, but at one of my first galleys in Los Angeles, this is probably 2015 or 2016, Gabriel Wolf was a guest.
Wow.
And the moderator gave him a printout of all of his lines from Pyramids of Mars, which at this point is almost 40 years on. And this is much closer in time to when Gabriel Wolf came back to do Impossible Planet and The Satan Pit. But the moderator gave him his lines from Pyramids of Mars, and he was reading out those lines 40 years later in the same silky voice. So for me, that was the same chills that you would have gotten from hearing Stephen Thorne reenact his lines 40 years later. And Gabriel Wolf was a small, unassuming, just cute little old man at this point, wearing a cardigan sweater or what have you. And I was just smitten with him from reading these lines 40 years on in the same voice, and yet looking so nice and friendly and kind and small.
Yeah, definitely. Same with Stephen Thorne. Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? And then they would never have thought 40, 50 years ago that we'd still be celebrating those performances now, would they?
They would have had no idea that we could watch them at the touch of a button the way that we can, or put on the Blu-ray and watch all the extra features.
Yeah.
And what's great about these documentaries, like they're able to get Nicholas Parsons' final appearance, and he shows up in the making of documentary of Curse of Fenric. And by the time it hits the streets and reaches my shelf and my DVD player, Nicholas Parsons has already passed on. But I can watch his last appearance, looking, still sharp as a tack, with great memories about recording the Curse of Fenric. And by the same token, we have Stephen Thorne on audio now because he was the guest villain in Barry Letz's second Third Doctor radio play, The Ghost of N-Space. He plays the bad guy in that, which is a great voice-only role, even if the story is perhaps not up to Barry's standard. And Stephen Thorne also did some of the audiobooks. I know that I heard The Mythmakers as done by Stephen Thorne. He does a great Odysseus, by the way. And when they brought Omega back for the 20th anniversary season, Arc of Infinity, if not the 20th anniversary special, you then have Ian Collier playing Omega instead, rather than Stephen Thorne. How do you compare the two? How do you rank the Ian Collier Omega, who then came back and did a few Omegas for Big Finish before he passed away? How do you compare Ian Collier to Stephen Thorne?
I haven't watched Arc of Infinity for ages. I've got to say, I'm at sort of at the stage with some of the classic stories now where I'm waiting for the Blu-ray collections, so that I can kind of watch them upscaled and then watch the behind the sofa after. So it's been a few years. I can't really think what he sounds like.
He has a deep voice, but it's not as booming as Stephen Thorne's. So Collier, of course, was also Stuart Hyde the year before Three Doctors in the Time Monster. But by the 80s, he has a very deep basso voice. He just doesn't have the resonance that Stephen Thorne does. So he doesn't do the same anguished cries.
Yeah, because his cry, Stephen Thorne's anguished cries when that brilliant scene when he lifts up his helmet to reveal nothing underneath. It's he's very anguished, isn't it? It's very very kind of heartrending. Yeah, I need to watch the Arc of Infinity again. Actually, that's.
It is great that in the novelization, the chapter title is literally the quote, "All things must be destroyed." Terrance is leaning into how good that line is.
Yeah, that was one of the things I noticed about this book was the way that the character of Joe is slightly changed in the book from the TV show, and it's such an odd thing. I don't know why it stuck out to me, but in the TV episode, when right at the start, when Dr. Tyler is telling the Doctor and Brigadier and Joe about the space lightning, and he says to the Doctor, "I'll pass my briefcase, will you?" And in the book, it's Joe that passes him the briefcase. He says, "Oh, Miss Grant, will you pass me that briefcase?" As if, Terrance Diggs decided that it was more something that a woman should be doing, is passing a man his briefcase, not something for the Doctor. And at the end of the story, when Omega agrees to let all the human characters go back to Earth through the the Singularity, I think it's called.
The big, enormous pillar of flame reaching up to
Yeah,
infinity.
that's it. This incredibly impressive pillar of steam. Uh, it's quite a nice moment that Joe doesn't in the TV episode. It's a nice moment when Joe doesn't want to go, and the Brigadier calls her Joe, which he never does. He always calls her Miss Grant. So it's quite a nice moment when he sort of persuades her by saying, "Come on, Joe," and he takes her away. And then in the book, Benton just bodily lifts her up and carries her through. Which again just sort of obviously takes a bit of autonomy away from Joe, but robs the Brigadier of a nice little moment as well of tenderness, because earlier than that, earlier in that same episode, or just earlier sort of in the story before that, he's been sort of berating them and saying, "Come on, you're still members of the unit. We've got a job to do," and things like that. So it felt like it was a couple of changes that didn't really need to be done, and were to Joe's detriment, I think, in a way.
It's funny that you mentioned that because on this show I just covered the very first two novelizations of Sarah Jane stories, both written by Terrance, because he did the novelization of Robot as Doctor Who and the Giant Robot. And then he steps back a story and he novelizes Planet of the Spiders, which is last week's episode. In each of those stories, he gives Sarah Jane a faint, has her literally faint from shock, which he never did on television. So in Doctor Who and the Giant Robot, Sarah faints at the sight of the K1 robot, which, considering that she was later the owner of K9, she should not be fainting at the sight of K1.
No.
And then in the Planet of the Spiders novelization, he also has her faint, I believe, at some point when she's being transported by the guards and captured and brought to captivity in the Citadel of the Spiders. So it almost seems that Terrance is just going back and adding these things so that the female companion is the helpless assistant and the damsel in distress, rather than an independent woman of agency, as Jo Grant was in so many of the other books and stories.
Yeah, it's an odd one, isn't it? And because it's interviews with Terrance Dicks where he talks about casting Katie Manning because she's more of a or less capable than Liz Shaw. That she again gets into more scrapes and needs to be rescued and things as well. So it's a bit of an unreconstructed view of male and female roles, isn't it? That Uncle Terry's got there.
But Katie Manning, of course, manages to transcend that because she stays on the show for 3 full seasons. She was the longest serving companion by time, probably just beating out Fraser Hines. And she was the only companion, at least for some of the stories, when Unit isn't involved, whereas Jamie always had a female sidekick. And of course, if you've met Katie at a convention, she is a force of nature. Everybody loves Katie. You'll never hear any bad words said about her ever. But she does a vivid portrayal of Jo. So Jo never seems helpless in her hands. Jo always seems strong and decisive, thanks to Katie Manning putting so much of herself into the character.
No, absolutely.
Have you met Katie?
Yes, yeah, two or three times. Yeah, she's amazing. Whether you're meeting her face to face or on stage, yeah, absolutely incredible. She's always got the audience in the palm of her hand. She's sort of hilarious, and and then meeting her one to one, she's so incredibly sort of warm, and the queues are always enormous if you're getting an autograph or anything because she has time for everybody as well to speak to everybody and kind of give them some attention. So yeah, really really lovely and such an ambassador for Doctor Who, isn't she? So incredibly generous with her time for fans.
I had the opposite experience at Galley before the pandemic because Carol Ann Ford and William Russell were guests, and this is not in any way, shape, or form a reflection on the two of them, but the person who was manning the autograph line, the line was so long compared to the time that they had to sign and compared to the size of the signing area. They had to be in and out, in and out. Do not talk to William Russell. do not talk to Carol Ann Ford. Just sign it and get out of the line. Which is unfortunate because when you see those two, you want to talk to them for as long as possible because they are, the originals.
Yeah.
And as I literally don't even. I'm literally walking down the queue to get my paperback from Carol Ann Ford. I just murmur "thank you" as I'm walking by, and I get yelled at by the line organizer for daring to say "thank you" as I'm walking away from her with my back turned. And again,
Yeah,
that is certainly not a reflection on them. This is just a function of how many people are at Galley versus how many people were online.
yeah, and you just instinctively say thank you, don't you? It's not like you just, it's not something you think about. But no, I hate those situations. They make you feel like a child again, don't they? They make you feel like you're at school, and you think, I'm an adult man. Why, why am I being, kind of corralled like a, like an unruly child?
Which is why I pay extra at Galley for the one-on-one opportunities, like the guest receptions, or in the case of this last guy, the VIP script reading with Mandip Gill. Because otherwise, if you're just on a fast-moving autograph line, you don't have the time to express your appreciation.
Yeah, definitely.
So it's worth it to get that one-on-one or one-on-5 as opposed to one-on-200 meeting times with these
Mhm.
guests. So I met Katie at a guest reception at Galley about 4 or 5 years. I will never forget the experience of sitting at a table with her and her, talking to me and asking about me and just being very affectionate.
Yeah, those experiences are fantastic, aren't they?
And I do regret, like you say, never seeing Pertwee.
I was really lucky because I got to meet him in March '96. So
Oh
it was only a couple
wow,
of months before he passed away. Yeah, this was convention I went to in Glasgow, and it had John Pertwee, Colin Baker, Elizabeth Sladen as well was there. So yeah, that was the only time I got to meet Liz Sladen as well. So it was it was really special. I was only about 13, I think, at the time as well. So I was just a really shy, kind of awkward kid, just absolutely starstruck because Pertwee was just larger than life. Just even all these people are amazing on stage and things, but Pertwee was just just incredible getting to see him. He really felt like this larger than life kind of complete star. It was it was totally bowled over.
I mean, you have to have a really good convention personality to just do that thing over and over again. And by all accounts, Pertwee was great at conventions because he had the stories and he had the shtick and he had his water pistol fights with Troughton. Must have
Yeah,
been glorious to see back in the day.
and he was in his full costume as well. Yeah, when I saw him, it was frilled shirt and cape and everything like that as well. So it was, it was amazing. Yeah.
Similar meeting Sacha Devon and Eric Roberts at Galley 2 weeks ago. And of course, stay tuned for a forthcoming episode of Trap One where Adam and I break down our respective Galley experiences. But Eric Roberts really has that vibrancy and he looks you directly in the eye and asks you personal questions. And Sacha Devon as well. Just so much fun. Just because, he knows what's happening in the last episode. He knows how Jody regenerates. He knows who the
Yeah.
villain is. And he asks you what you think, and he just, smirks at your answer because he knows, but he can't tell you whether you're right or not. So the
Yeah,
two of them are definitely guests worth seeking out because they are a lot of fun to talk to one-on-one, like Katie Manning.
I remember seeing Paul McGann at a convention, Newcastle over here, not long before the 50th, and I asked him if he was in the 50th, and he just looked me straight in the eye, and he was like, "I'm not in it." And I kind of wanted to do the Larry David thing where he kind of looks somebody right in the face and kind of goes and kind of like scrutinizes them like that. Which, I mean, to be fair, he wasn't in it. So he had the perfect way of denying he was in it without lying, but knowing that he was in a supplementary episode which fed into it,
That's
which was
right.
still a complete surprise. But yeah, I mean, so the trouble is, they're all good actors as well, so you would never know whether they were lying or not.
My regret is that I had Night of the Doctor spoiled for me because the week before it dropped, I had been at the very first Long Island Doctor Who con, which is, early November 2013. So we got to see like one scene from Day of the Doctor, which had already been released, and Osgood was in that scene. And we had a few guests from the new series who were there because it was for the 50th anniversary. It was a pretty big convention. But I
Mhm.
was at dinner the last night, with another Doctor Who podcaster who has friends of friends. And that podcaster told us at dinner, sitting there in the Applebee's across the highway from the convention hotel, yes, Paul McGann has done an episode, and he's going to be regenerating into John Hurt, and that's going to drop next week. I'm like, maybe I didn't want to know that. And then, sure enough, when Night of the Doctor airs, drops in the morning, I was at work, but checking my Facebook notifications during the day, OMG, OMG, you won't believe it. Yeah, I already knew, sorry. And then when he sees I'm the Doctor, but not the one you were expecting, to be able to see that line cold without foreknowledge would have been the greatest thing in the world, and I was deprived of that by being in the wrong place at the wrong time.
That's so annoying. I was lucky that I didn't I wasn't spoiled. So yeah, I went into it and yeah, it was a really nice surprise to see that. So yeah, I was very lucky. But I'm sure it was all over Twitter by then. So it was just pure luck that I think I saw a link that somebody had said, "Watch this. Don't read anything. Just watch it."
It does make you wonder, though, what it would have been like as a fan in December 1972, putting on your TV and seeing Patrick Troughton show up for the first time in 3.5 years, screen time wise. I guess War Games would have been in June of '69. And then to see William Hartnell for the first time since October '66. Are you aware that you are watching a special once in a lifetime moment, the only time that all three of these doctors are going to be in the same shot? Or was it just another episode and nobody paid it any mind? Because, I didn't get to see it until 1985, much, much, much later, and William Hartnell had already passed on by then. And you would have seen it even later than that, being in the UK.
It would have been in the 90s. Yeah, I mean, I think it had a Radio Times cover. I feel like I'm sure so Radio Times cover and everything. And the
It
episode
did.
being called "The Three Doctors," you would, I suppose, even if you went in cold, that would certainly kind of excite your your imagination when you saw the title card come up.
But Doctor Who fandom wasn't Doctor Who fandom, all capital letters, in 1972 the way that it is now. I think that was before the first UK convention, probably. And again, you didn't have this mythology of, the first Doctor versus the second Doctor versus it was just one Doctor at a time. And then all of a
Mm.
sudden, you get all three of them at once. And then shortly after that, you have the Radio Times 10th anniversary special. And I think that may have been the first time that fans realized that stories were missing, if memory serves me right.
Yeah, I think I've read that. Yeah.
And then fandom comes together, and then by the mid to late '70s, Ian Levine is rescuing film cans off of the burn pile. And then you have conventions, and then you have fanzines, and then Peter Capaldi is high up in Doctor Who fandom by 1974 and gets an invite to the studio session for Monster of Peladon. So this story, maybe, if you look at it that way, maybe this story is the watershed that turns Doctor Who into Doctor Who fandom.
Yeah, because it's around this time there's the fan club, isn't there? I can't remember the guy that founded the fan club, and then Peter Capaldi spent some time trying to wrest it off him, didn't he?
Yes.
Or to set up a rival one or something like that. Yeah, that's a great story.
I know when the Monster of Peladon DVD came out, this is in 2010, and of course, in the States, I didn't know that much about Peter Capaldi in 2010, but my kid had just been born, so we would split the feeding times just so we could get, my wife and I 6 hours of sleep between us. So I would stay up until 3 in the morning to handle the 3 a.m. feeding. So I was watching the Monster of Peladon DVDs at, 2 in the morning, waiting for the kid to wake up so I could hand her her bottle and they get my 6 hours of sleep. But during the audio I'd watch the episode and then the audio commentary right after, one a night. So I'd watch episode 2, then listen to the commentary. Next night, episode 3, listen to the commentary. And I vividly remember, Barry, let's say, Peter Capaldi was in the studio for this recording because I invited him as a fan of the show.
Oh wow!
And at this point, I would have seen Torchwood Children of Earth, where he's, one of the main characters. And I probably would have been aware that he was also in Fires of Pompeii. But that was the beginning of my realizing that Peter Capaldi was a really big deal, much bigger than he is in the States. And then 3 years later, when he's announced as the new Doctor Who, at that point I was very, very excited because by then I had a much better sense of who he was in relation to UK television and in relation to Doctor Who fandom and the show itself. To the moment where he comes out on stage during the reveal show, cosplaying as William Hartnell and grabbing his lapels and staring down the bridge of his nose at the camera.
It's funny because I always loved him as an actor, in the thick of it, and he's with the BBC did an adaptation of the Three Musketeers over here as well, where he was Richelieu, which they had to kill him off after the first series because he got the part as the Doctor in it. But I always loved him in everything. But he was one of those actors I could never think of his name. I could never bring it to mind. There's a few actors like that. Like I mean, I can remember it now, but Jim Broadbent's name I really struggle to remember a lot of the time.
Mm.
Obviously, until he was cast as the Doctor, and now I know the name really, really well. So yeah, that's what my advice to actors whose name I can't remember is to be cast as the Doctor.
Yeah, Jim Broadbent got to play the Doctor 14 years before Peter Capaldi, so I guess he wins that particular battle.
Yeah, actually, no, yeah, he has played the Doctor, but I still struggle to remember his name. He had such a short tenure.
I think they had 3 lines of dialogue.
Yeah.
I'll tell you though. I'll tell you my very first Peter Capaldi encounter in the early '80s. I'm 8 years old. My kid sister is 2. At this point, my mother, at this particular point in her life, she doesn't have a lot of friends because she's been home with a small kid, and she's trying to change careers. And if she wanted to see a movie, she has to go with me because she doesn't have a lot of friends that she can go and see these import foreign films with playing at the specialty cinema in our hometown on Long Island. So when the movie Local Hero came out, she was desperate to see it because Burt Lancaster and Scottish accents. So me at age 8 or 9 is forced to go along and sit there suffering in the theater to watch. And the movie Local Hero had no appeal for me at all at that age because I didn't know who Burt Lancaster was, and I wouldn't have been able to understand the Scottish accents. Then you have this whimsical movie about big business versus small towns, and you have a big part for Fulton Mackay, who I was a couple of years away for Doctor Who Phantom, so I wouldn't have known that he was Dr. Quinn. The only part of the film that I remember is when Peter Capaldi is on the date with the local woman and she has the webbed feet. That was the only part of the film that I remembered for years. And I would always criticize my mom for dragging me to see this stupid movie where the woman has webbed feet. And then that scene resurfaces in 2013 on the internet when Peter Capaldi is cast as the Doctor, and that's his first major film role. I'm like, wait a minute. I vividly remember that, and I have trauma from seeing this film at the theater, not the film for an 8-year-old to see with his mom or ever. I'm like, wow, that's Peter Capaldi. So, belatedly, 30 years after the fact, thank you for introducing me to Doctor Who.
I hadn't seen that film for years and years. I need to revisit that.
I only saw it the one time. I have never seen it again. Even after Capaldi became the Doctor, I was not motivated to seek it out. Maybe I should show it to my kid now and maybe force her through the same generational suffering.
But yeah, he's done pretty well post Doctor Who as well. He was in the Suicide Squad. Was quite a big deal.
And he was also in Paddington. He played, I think, one of the next door neighbors.
Yeah, he's in both Paddington films. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, which they're especially, I don't know about over there. They're really big over here.
And it turns out that they're really big in Ukraine, where the actor who did the voice of Paddington was dubbed by Volodymyr Zelensky before he became president of Ukraine.
Yeah, I just saw that the other day. That's crazy. I wonder who dubbed Peter Capaldi.
Possibly the mayor of Kyiv, who was the former heavyweight champion of the world.
Yeah.
There's a story for you. So let's wrap up our discussion of the Three Doctors then. Any other particular memories of reading the book that jumped out at you as you were reading it this week in preparation for the recording?
Probably just following what I was saying about the way Joe is maybe slightly not treated as well. I feel like there's some amelioration of the Brigadier because one of the main criticisms that people have of the Three Doctors is that the Brigadier is written as much more foolish than he than he normally is.
Yes.
And I feel like that's toned down in the book. Let's say the chroma line isn't there, although he's still a bit kind of bullish about things, and he doesn't accept that the second Doctor has turned up. He thinks that the third Doctor is sort of unregenerated or something like that.
Right.
But there's a bit of business, isn't there, when he meets Hollis, which in the TV show, they just bump into each other in the sand dunes. but in the he gets to do a bit of sort of military stuff in the book, in that he realizes that Hollis is following him, so he manages to evade him and double back, and then kind of get the jump on him a bit. So I feel like it does make the Brigadier seem a bit more intelligent than the TV episodes do. And the other thing is that the book calls the second Doctor's recorder a flute all the way through. I don't think it's referred to as a recorder once, is it? And I don't understand why that is, because I always thought the point of the second Doctor having a recorder is that most kids learn the recorder at school. So it was like this thing of, oh, you could be a bit like the Doctor because you've got a recorder. In the way that when Russell T Davies brought the series back, he wanted the TARDIS key to be a normal Yale key, which loads of people would have for their front doors. So again, kids could be like, oh, it's like the TARDIS key. So yeah, I wondered why he made it a flute. It's a minor quibble.
I will say, I've got the book open now on page 33. A hand sneaked under his arm and neatly plucked the flute from his fingers. Properly speaking, said a rather huffy voice, the instrument is known as a recorder. So I guess Terrance has it both ways.
Yeah, but the scenes later on when he's asking Omega to conjure him an instrument, on TV he says recorder, but in the book he says flute. So maybe that you've probably found the one instance of recorder there, but I haven't watched them both in quick succession, or having consumed them both in quick succession. I think the book says flute way more times than the dialogue in the TV show.
And when I record my review of the book right after this interview, I'll try and address that and see if we can figure out how many times he says flute versus recorder. We can have the ultimate showdown, flute versus recorder, here on Doctor Who Literature.
I guess that's something that'd be easier on the Kindle. You can search for.
It's like when I was reading Eric Sayward's misbegotten novelization of Resurrection of the Daleks, because you and I did a Trap One on it several years ago, and the word pteroleptal showed up so many times that I did a search on my Kindle, because I bought the Kindle edition, to see what the winner was. And I said for Trap 1, the word pteroleptal appears in this book more than the word Dalek. Now, that's not true, because the book is called Resurrection of the Dalek, so the word Dalek appears a lot. But the word pteroleptal appears much more than it should.
Yeah, we've got pteroleptal poetry and all sorts in there, don't we?
Eric, just stop trying to make it happen. It's over, man. They haven't been on television in 40 years now. Just let it go, bro. Let it go. So, Mark, thanks very much for joining me as we discuss everything except the Three Doctors today. And where else can we hear your voice coming up on podcasts going forward, other than the Trap Ones?
I'm on the most recent episode of Flight Through Entirety, talking about the Doctor, the Widow, and the Wardrobe. And I'm not sure when, but at some point I'll be on The Real McCoy talking about one of the Virgin New Adventures, or the VNAs.
Oh, wow. Which new adventure?
I don't know yet. It's still to be decided. But yeah, you should listen to that podcast anyway, because it's great. But at some point in the future, I'll be on there again.
I just listened to their Love and War, and I have their Transit in my queue, in my 6-week backlog, so I'll get to that at some point within the next couple of weeks. And do they call it the NAs, or do they call it the VNAs like Modern Fandom?
I don't know, actually. I don't know if they abbreviate. I think they might just call them New Adventures.
And you and I have a few Trap Ones coming out. So we have our discussion of Pirate Planet, which is coming. We also have our retrospective on the late Bob Baker, who passed away a short while ago. We're going to be discussing his very long legacy in terms of Doctor Who stories on Trap One. And I have a few other ideas in the hopper that you may or may not be on. I'll be discussing the next episode, Legend of the Sea Devils, although I don't know if you signed up for that one.
Yep, no, I'll be on that one as well. Yeah.
Oh, terrific. That'll be a lot of fun. And you are going to be joining me. We have discussed which episode you're going to be on. I'm going to leave it as a surprise for the audience, but you'll be back in a few months talking about one of the other Terrance mid to late 70s novelizations.
I can't wait.
So certainly looking forward to having you back on. Mark, thanks very much for joining me, and have a great night.
Thank you, you too.
Doctor Who and the Three Doctors by Terrance Dix, televised as The Three Doctors, teleplay by Bob Baker, or Robert Baker, on the book's copyright page, and Dave Martin, televised in December 1972 and January 1973, published in November 1975. I wonder if this book isn't Terrance Dix's best ever showing for chapter titles. There are 11 chapters, and more than half of them have titles that sound like great B-movies. Lightning from Space, The Menace of the Black Hole, Beyond the Unknown, Return Through the Flame. That's gotta be a sequel to something scorching. And say it with me like Stephen Thorne, All Things Shall Be Destroyed, if Stephen Thorne had a scratchy, reedy, Brooklyn accented voice like yours truly, that is. My previous read-through of this book yielded the following note, in a review that I never did manage to commit to my blog. I said Chapter 1 was noticeably more juvenile, comical, and less visceral than Terrance's earlier works. That's a 5-year-old note now. It may be true. My next note was on a rather weak sentence. Joe screamed, and the doctor turned to see what was the matter. At the end of Chapter 2, I had noted, whereas most previous Dix novelizations were more detailed and had more dialogue than their parent TV stories, this one is sadly much less so. Hello, pretentious man. I may have thought that back in March 2017, but I certainly take a lot of value today from the observations and asides in the book. The operational art of Terrance shines through in the opening paragraph, which takes a long, tension-free opening pan on TV and turns it into a short, breathless paragraph. Quote, For an adventure that was to be one of the most astonishing of the Doctor's very long life, it all began very quietly. It started, in fact, with a silvery gray balloon, drifting peacefully out of the blue morning sky, to land on the flat, marshy ground of an Essex bird sanctuary. Hanging from the balloon was a bright orange box, about the size and shape of a car battery. There's not much going on in the early going of The Three Doctors on TV, and the first chapter, apart from Terrance's snappy writing, isn't exactly grabbing. But Terrance gets in note-perfect descriptions of 3 series regulars in a single paragraph, as Dr. Tyler arrives at Unit HQ. There were 3 of them. A very small, very pretty, fair-haired girl. A tall man, with a clipped mustache, wearing the uniform of a brigadier. And an even taller man, flamboyantly dressed in a velvet smoking jacket and ruffled shirt, who seemed to be known only as the Doctor. Although we don't have the young old face or the shock of white hair yet, the Doctor does rub his chin here in Chapter 3. We also don't have the comic bit of business with Pertwee asking the Brigadier for a silicon rod so he can stir his coffee, which I assume was improvisational jazz devised between Pertwee and Courtney in rehearsal. Oh, and Hollis on TV is Hollis in the book. But the Brigadier's sigh that one of the Doctor's dense, techno-babbly explanations that, quote, most of the Doctor's explanations left him none the wiser, is laugh-out-loud funny, as is Sergeant Benton's being thankful for an excuse to get out of the Brigadier's immediate vicinity, end quote. It's when the Gel Guards show up that you really begin to appreciate Terrance's additions to the script. The guards in the book are how you want to see them, but definitely not as how they were realized on film. Shot through with iridescent colors, like a patch of oil on wet pavement. Hard to focus your eyes on, as if in some strange way it wasn't quite there. Sign me up. You don't laugh at this version. In Chapter 2, there's a nifty action sequence where a, quote, milling crowd of jelly creatures recombines and merges into one another to form a huge blob. It was as though, Terrance writes, their target found, they no longer needed their ghastly attempt at a human shape. If only that had been the case on TV. And there's a really good description of Sergeant Benton that I noticed this week, which I hadn't highlighted 5 years ago. Sergeant Benton used his rank to jump the queue and grabbed an anti-tank rifle. Experience of hostile alien life forms had taught him that the heavier your armament, the better. Shouldering the cumbersome weapon with ease, he ran to see what the blazes was going on. And I'll admit it, I read that last sentence in my head in John Levine's voice. Chapter 3, that's the same chapter where the Doctor is going to rub his chin, also introduces the Time Lords, who to date in the novelizations had only been seen briefly in the opening chapter of Doctor Who and the Doomsday Weapon, and the floating figure in the Terror of the Autons book. But here, Terrance ramps up his descriptive powers, with a certainly tongue-in-cheek line about the Time Lords keeping a benevolent and watchful eye on innumerable planets and times. and the line about the jagged black hole in space which seemed to pulse and quiver with evil life is an easy-looking sentence, but you'd be hard-pressed to find any other author who could duplicate that combination of adjectives and short, easy-to-speak-aloud words. The second Doctor, when he appears, also in Chapter 3, is, quote, a middle-sized, middle-aged man in a shabby old frock coat and rather baggy check trousers. His untidy black hair hung in a fringe over his forehead, and his dark brown eyes were at once humorous and sad. Joe, we're told, took to him instantly. In Chapter 5, Terrance has Troughton draw himself up to his full height, quote, such as it was, we're helpfully told. Alas, there's no Beatles quote, no offer by Patrick Troughton to learn their song on his recorder. That was likely more improvisational jazz added in rehearsal. And Troughton's TV line about turning on a TV for useless and conflicting information is also missing. In order to avoid confusion, Terrance adds Joe decided to think of the Troughton Doctor as Doctor 2, which I just realized 37 years too late rhymes with Doctor Who. Terrance easily captures the instant dislike between the two doctors, and as Graham Burke told us via Terrance in last week's episode, between the two actors themselves at the time, by having Joe observe, it didn't look as if the strange collaboration was going to work at all. What disappointed me 5 years ago, in Chapter 3, is that this is the first time the first Doctor has appeared in print since 1966, or 1973, if you count the Target reprints of the 3 Frederick Muller Hartnell books, and the first time he appears in a Target original, but the only description is of a rather cross-looking white-haired old man. That's it. Well, okay, much later on page 99, the Time Lords see Hartnell as the proud, fierce face of a formidable old man. But 28 pages away from the ending is an odd time to finally describe your front cover illustration lead.
Look!
Ah, there you are. I seem to be stuck up here. Hmm? Oh, so you're my replacements. A dandy and a clown. Have you done anything?
Well, we've assessed the situation.
Just as I thought. Nothing.
Well, it's not easy, you know.
Not as if we knew what that stuff is.
No.
Then I'll tell you. It's a time bridge.
Is it what? I see.
Now, what's a bridge for, eh?
Well, crossing?
Right. So stop dilly-dallying and cross it.
Wait!
You faded him again.
I did not
Yes,
fade
you
it. You
certainly
saw
did.
it.
You
Faded
faded
it.
it.
I hate to ask, but who was that?
Me.
The Brigadier's portrayal in the story has been derided throughout fandom as turning the beloved character into a buffoon. In Chapter 4 here, he opened his mouth like a stranded fish, which certainly completes the transformation. That's a case of Terrance leaning into the source material rather than, trying to fix it. But you can stop worrying about that and focus instead on Terrance's note-perfect description of Omega's realm, which far exceeds the modest TV location shoot landscape. Quote, stretching as far as Joe could see was a sort of plain of dunes, dull gray in color, bleak, desolate and lifeless. The sky was a threatening purple, and everything about the place seemed somehow horribly wrong. Joe realized that it was completely and utterly silent. No wind noise, no bird song, just a dead sinister calm. In the realm, we meet Dr. Tyler, standing in front of a dully gray sea that was hard to distinguish from the land, idly tossing pebbles into the water. And grounding the descriptions through Joe's eyes also gives them more immediacy, as is her inner reflection that they must be in limbo, or a sort of purgatory. Terrance builds on that purgatory theme a few pages later, by having the Time Lord Chancellor suggest that the Doctor is actually dead. Fortunately, we're not in the series finale of Lost. We're still in the 3 Doctors, and nobody's dead, and nobody's in purgatory. In Chapter 8, Terrance has the 3rd Doctor observe that, with the chance to invent a world, it was surely a waste of your opportunities to create such an unattractive one. That's a bit unfair, though. While yes, the location for Omega's world isn't quite as splendid as the one in Terrance's mind's eye, the world in Terrance's mind is truly splendid, and those descriptions are worth savoring. The guest cast is slightly bigger in the book, with a skeptical government VIP visiting the Brigadier in Chapter 5, who gets no dialogue and exits before the rest of our heroes are transported to Omega's realm, at the equivalent of the Episode 2 cliffhanger. And Terrance restructures the Episode 2 cliffhanger to occur earlier, in the middle of Chapter 5, on page 61 of 127, in my 1984 reprint anyway, less than halfway through the book. Our first glimpse of Omega, and several Third Doctor and Joe and Dr. Tyler scenes are shifted into the Episode 3 material. That includes Omega's first line, "At last, a Time Lord within my power." Chapter 5 instead ends from the Brigadier's POV, as he opens the door to Unit HQ to find Omega's realm before him, which makes this, at roughly the book's halfway point, page 64, a sort of alternate Episode 2 cliffhanger, rather than the Wizard of Oz-style image of the unit house floating through space as we saw on television. However, one bit of the Episode 2 material on TV that Terrance did not port over into the book, Chapter 6 on, was a capture-escape-capture loop from Dr. Tyler, who had ruefully acknowledged, for the cameras,
That was a bit of a waste of time, wasn't it?
all that material, openly ridiculed on TV, ejected, not in the book at all. Speaking of the Wizard of Oz, Omega's dwelling is transformed from caves on location to, quote, "a towering castle beaten from solid brass, with hundreds of towers and minarets glinting dully beneath the towering purple sky, resembling the Arabian Nights castle of some caliph." Hoo boy, not on TV it wasn't. Omega, once he finally arrives in Chapter 6, is as impressive in the book as Stephen Thorne was on television, with Joe, our audience identification figure, likening him to a superstar, capital S and everything. Less impressive is his mask being described as brazen, an adjective that Terrance utilizes 7 times in the book, although, hold my beer, Christopher H. Bidmead cheerfully shouts from his word processor as he's drafting the script of Frontios. Omega in Chapter 7 is described as several feet taller than both the Third Doctor and Benton, who the script described as already tall men. Omega has a palpable effect on the prose, Joe noting that this is the first time she had ever seen the Doctor afraid. The Doctor's being afraid had been a plot point earlier on TV in The Mind of Evil, but that novelization is about a decade away, so one can forgive Book Joe for not remembering it. Similarly, Chapter 7 says this is the first time outside of the Master that the Doctor was opposed by a fellow Time Lord. Both books featuring the meddling monk are more than a decade out from here. Terrance, however, does not stint on an opportunity to make us feel sympathy for Omega. Omega has awesome powers, as we see in Chapter 9, in a way that could never have been shown on TV, not even by director Lenny Mayne. He strode across to one wall and waved his hand. Immediately, the surface became smooth and polished, a mirror of bronze. I wish we'd gotten that on TV. And of the Doctor's mind at meeting his childhood hero, Terrance tells us in a long passage, "A whirlpool of emotions. On one level, he was still reeling from the shock of realizing that the long-dead Omega, the great solar engineer, who had sacrificed his life to bring the secret of time travel to his people, was somehow still alive in this impossible place. But at the forefront of his mind was another terrifying thought. One thing was quite certain. Brooding on his wrongs for untold years had sent Omega mad. Yet in this world he was all-powerful, and the Doctor and his friends were in Omega's hands. For the first time in his life, the Doctor knew the full meaning of despair." Again, strictly speaking, this is not the first time the Doctor has known the full meaning of despair. He has yet to read the script of The Dominators, but that novelization is also a decade away, so in book terms, thankfully, it also hasn't happened yet. In Chapter 7, from the Third Doctor's own POV, Terrance points out the story's mythology value by reminding us that the Doctor is in awe of the powerful yet unstable Omega and is fluctuating between ironic amiability and sudden terrifying range. The Doctors are reluctant to discuss such matters in the presence of outsiders, Terrance writes, but all normal laws seem suspended inside the black hole. Of course, the Third Doctor's awe of Omega is contrasted with his distaste for his previous self. "Didn't the fellow take anything seriously?" the Doctor laments, and, quote, "found it difficult to realize that this scruffy, rather comical figure was an earlier version of himself. He felt this second Doctor was like a sort of younger brother, with a number of rather irritating mannerisms that he himself had outgrown. That's a perfect encapsulation of the antipathy between those two Doctors that's a hallmark of the TV episode. and as Mark and I discussed earlier, will be a hallmark of every other multi-Doctor story yet to come. I was amused by the unassuming figure of Doctor Who, who seemed positively dwarfed by the tall figures around him. Yet, Terrance writes, he was studying the huge robed figure of Omega with interest, peering up into the savage metal mask with an expression of polite anticipation, like someone meeting his host at a party. Later on, with regard to the third Doctor, we learn that the second Doctor, quote, was thoroughly tired of being harangued by this tall, elegant version of himself. If that's what he was to become, he thought illogically, he'd sooner stay as he was. Ha! During the big confrontation with Omega in Chapter 9, as the second Doctor runs mental circles around the villain, Terrance pulls back a bit to tell us there was no hint of foolishness in the serious face. Later in the same chapter, as this Doctor observes that Omega can never leave his domain, Terrance writes, in the little Doctor's compassionate voice, the words had the sonorous ring of a judge passing sentence. And in Chapter 8, the second Doctor feels, quote, slightly conscience-stricken about trying to cheat his later self on a coin toss with his double-headed Martian crown. Perhaps it was a bit much to play tricks on himself, Terrance observes, wryly. The Brigadier finally gets to redeem his earlier buffoonery, as he teams up with Hollis in Chapter 7. And yes, everything Mark said earlier about Terrance doing more with the first meeting between the two men is true. The Brig recalls being a young subaltern, which again takes the wind out of Chris Chibnall's unusual assertion in Survivors of the Flux that the Brigadier was somehow a corporal a year or two before he became a colonel. The Episode 3 cliffhanger in the book is fairly gorgeous, with a very long description of Omega's wraith on page 91, with tons of visceral adjectives, and the gorgeous added touch that the Doctor could smell the reek of sulfur on its breath. Although this is nominally a Three Doctors book, as Mark told us earlier, you don't really get inside the head of the Hartnell Doctor. That is a bit odd. Maybe Terrance wasn't familiar enough with the character at this point to venture too far inside? We certainly get the POV of almost every other character. I love the line, Hollis's countryman's instincts for a landscape seem to be in full operation. Even Omega gets a classic line in Chapter 9, quote, resigned to the stupidity of all other beings in the universe. But at least Terrance does make good use of the space of the Doctors he's written for before, 2 and 3. Like the observation, during the fight with Omega's wraith, that the third Doctor was one of the few two-armored beings to have mastered the complex art of Venusian Aikido. And Doctor 2's chilling observation, during the same fight, that he wondered what would happen to him if his other self were to be killed. Presumably he too would wink out of existence, writes Terrance, to scare all the kids reading, and cease to be. The restructuring of the Episode 3 material into Episode 4 makes this unusually for the Target line a book that makes the last act longer, not shorter. Mark told us earlier about some really nifty embellishments added during the unit/gel guard fight scenes. The book adds deleted scenes too, or perhaps Terrance's own embellishments, like a big fight scene with the Brigadier driving Bessie through a chase with the gel guards in the Episode 4 material. All we got on TV was some unintelligible shouting, which, according to the online transcript, is Sergeant Benton warning the Brigadier to mind that rock. It ends in the book with the Brigadier saying, "Enjoyed that. A very pleasant little drive." There's also a bizarre but funny exchange late in the book, where the Brigadier and Joe discuss Army food supplies, with the Brig waxing nostalgic about 1940 vintage canned beef, which Joe insists is left over from the Boer War. That sounds like some observational humor that Baker and Martin tried to put into an earlier, 75-minute draft of Episode 4 that Terrance had to edit down for TV, but that he felt would fit fine in the book. And it does, kinda. The book may set a Target record for most uses of the word purple, by the way. I counted 6, though it felt like a lot more than that. For example, as the Doctors escape Omega's citadel in Chapter 9, quote, outside was a night of howling storm, lightning streaking across the purple sky, there's that word again, and winds whipping the gray sands into swirling clouds. And leading into the climactic Doctors Omega showdown in Chapter 10, Terrance opens the scene, and what a scene. Quote, the castle was still in ruins, the metal walls cracked and buckled, the roof gaping open to the purple sky. The Doctor knew that by simply willing it so, Omega could have brought it back to perfect repair. It was a measure of the depth of Omega's despair that he had not bothered to even do that. And by the way, Unit HQ in Chapter 11 has a parquet floor, As if.
Oh, brother Time Lords, I have played your game. Now it is your turn to play mine. And there can be no escape for any of us.
You are wrong, Omega. You can have your freedom. It is here.
What is this childish contraption?
The only freedom you can ever have. Take it. Take it, Omega. Take it!
Commands! You command me! This is my world! I command! And you pester me with trinkets!
Run! Come quick!
And by the way, Terrance restructures that climactic showdown in the book to give the second and third Doctors a little more agency. The wrap-up chapter adds some emotional beats, like after the Brigadier eulogizes the Doctors, and the Doctors then materialize, in the book only, the Brig gets to roar out a book-only line, "What the blazes do you mean, frightening us like that?" If only Nick Courtney had been able to say that on TV. The Time Lord President also recalls presiding over the Doctor's trial in the War Games, a story that won't be novelized for like 4 more years, but Terrance mentions it often in these early books. The second Doctor tries playing a harmonica. Not very well, Terrance informs us. And the emotional depth elsewhere in that chapter? Well, the third Doctor broods over having had to destroy Omega. Joe observes that, quote, he never found his victories a source of unalloyed pleasure. Somehow there was always too much sympathy for the defeated enemy. End quote. Joe, of course, respected the Doctor's scruples, but didn't share them, we're told. And as the Doctor is gifted his freedom by the Time Lords, Terrance dips back into his head one last time to remind us that he wasn't sure he wanted to go. Unlike David Tennant, for the first time in many years of wandering, he found something that could be called a home, and he didn't want to give it up. Not completely, that is. The last word goes to Mr. Hollis. The thought of describing his adventures to his wife and trying to answer her questions filled him with horror. So when I read this book in 2017, I wasn't very taken with it, according to my notes. Maybe I was just burned out from the intensity of having blogged about the Target books for 3 straight months by that point. Looking back on it now, it's slim by page and word count, but boy does Terrance pack on the added value. Deleted scenes, extra dialogue, extra humor, extra pathos, tons of rewarding POV observational humor. Oh, and one last point. The final score? Mark was right. It's flute 30, recorder 2. Not even close. Thank you, Terrance Dix. Next time, to quote a TV guide blurb in the States from the mid-1990s, when the story came up on public television, the Doctor is about to let the Zygons be bygones. Thank you for joining me on another episode of the Doctor Who Literature Podcast. I'm Jason, your host and editor and producer. Special thanks to my special guest, Mark from the Trap One Podcast. This podcast is brought to you by Anchor and can also be found on Spotify and Google Podcasts. You can find me on Twitter at Doctor Who Novels, that's Dr. Who Novels, and you can also find me on Trap One, coming up real soon. I write about Doctor Who on Twitter, using the hashtag Doctor Who Pilgrimage, that's Dr. Who Pilgrimage. Please drop me a line with your comments, questions, and suggestions. Next time, we'll be discussing Doctor Who and the Loch Ness Monster from 1976. We'll again be joined by a very special guest, back for a second appearance on Doctor Who Literature. Thank you for listening, and whatever you do, keep turning the pages.